analysis of the impact of globalization on economic growth, the way it was analyzed and also summarized in the paper that I hope all of you read, that I shared about the globalization index and analysis on of globalization on economic growth. Yeah? So in line with previous studies, as we've spoken before, the study finds again that countries that have that are proceeding well with globalization, that are more globalized, that are having more aspects of globalization in the different dimensions that we spoke about, they are enjoying a larger, a higher economic growth. And as we spoke before, they find that for the three dimensions, economic, social, and political globalization, they are all three positively correlated or positively associated with economic growth, and that this result is especially given in developing countries. So they did the assessments, and I'm going to talk about it again briefly in developed and developing countries, and they show that this result is especially giving in developing countries. But then they use the different classifications that we spoke about de jure, de facto, and the different dimensions to try to basically understand more about what is exactly the reason driving this result. Where does it exactly come from? Is it the de jure side, or is it the de facto side? And is it the one or the other dimension that is actually driving this result more? And what they find out is that there is a difference. When it comes to the economic and the political globalization, it is rather the de jure side that matters for economic growth. However, when it comes to the social globalization, it seems to be the de facto side of globalization that is driving higher economic growth. So we talked a little bit about implications of this. Do you remember what, or can you tell me what this exactly implies? So what does it mean? De jure economic globalization is driving economic growth. What does it tell us? What is the implication of this kind of results? Anybody recalls? Or anybody could tell me? So far, this slide is something we had already a few ways back. I didn't add anything new yet. It's just to recap and continue where we stopped. So, do you remember? I assume everyone remembers the difference between de jure and de facto globalization, right? Or you studied for the midterm and it's all out again. So what does it imply when we say the de jure economic and political globalization is what matters, but when it comes to the social globalization, it's the de facto globalization what matters? Kiber?
I think it means the legalization or the rules in regard to economic and political globalization, such as like tariff laws and political globalization, meaning like they can, I don't know what was that. I'm not sure, but that and added to the real social globalization, which include people coming in and out, and how much the culture is infused, and tourism and such being together will lead to economic growth, as far as I understood.
Yes, right. So there is a difference here basically in the implications on what really matters. So if and now I added a bit more details to the slide as what we had it so far, to feed in some more details. Basically, the implications here, this is exactly the same sentence again. De jure economic and political globalization and de facto social globalization. So what does it imply? It implies, first, the result on the de jure economic globalization, the first part implies that countries that have less institutional restrictions on trade, and trade means trades of goods and trades of services, and not just goods, but all in all trade. But also We know trade globalization is only a part of the economic globalization. There is also the financial side. So countries that have loose restrictions on the financial flows that allow for capital investments in different countries, that allow for international investments and have policies that make it easier, policies that are clear, clear investment laws, efficient investment laws, and so on. These countries on average, enjoy higher economic growth. So this is what the first part of the sentence implies. Now we have three components, de jure economic globalization, the de jure political globalization, and the de facto social globalization seems to be the one mattering most. So the first part about the economic one means that it is more than the actual flows actually of goods and services and financial flows. It is already having the right environment, the right institutional framework, the right laws and regulations. This is what the de jure part is about. I remember the laws, the regulations, the policies for international trade and for international investment seem to be the one driving economic growth in their results. And so they did the empirical assessments, they look at the different components, and they found that those are the one that matters the most. When it comes to the political globalization, again, they find that the de jure political globalization is what matters most, more even than the de facto political globalization. So again, they find that when countries have the institutions and the policies and the laws that makes them integrated politically in the world, and in the world, in international organizations, in the connections with other countries, and so on, those countries seem to be having a higher economic growth. Now, what is striking here is how the results for social globalization is different. So when it comes to the social globalization, the result here is that the de facto, not the de jure, the de facto social globalization is what matters for economic growth. And this implies basically it's not enough to just have the infrastructure available to have social globalization. It's not enough to just have the possibility for people to travel by having airports, or the possibility for having international connections by just having internet connection and phone lines and so on, by having newspapers. I remember that was the de jure part. This is not enough. But what they find is that there has to be basically actual flows of people, of information, of knowledge between countries, between borders, and that this is what drives higher economic growth. So the result here on the de facto social globalization basically implies that citizens need to really exchange knowledge and information in order to promote economic growth. And this, if you remember, is in line with the informational knowledge spillover theory that we spoke about. That when you have really actual flows of people between countries, migration, tourism, international students, people visit different countries, flows between different countries, the actual flow of information, of knowledge. We talked also about exporting goods that are of knowledge and patents and so on, that also hold information itself that other countries can benefit from. All this leads to actual spillover of knowledge internationally and seems to be promoting economic growth more than just saying, okay, it's possible to happen. And this is different from what we found, or what the authors of the analysis find for the economic and political globalization. So that's interesting. The social globalization, it's all about the actual exchange that really happens. So what this implies is having the infrastructure available to exchange persons. Like, as I said, having airports, for example, just there is not enough, because many countries have airports, but they are not really frequented, and not many people are traveling there. So, okay, it's good to have that access. The option is there, but if it's not really used, it doesn't really give the needed boost for economic growth, which happens through the actual exchange. So having just the infrastructure available to exchange persons or to exchange information, internet, or culture is not sufficient. Of course, it's necessary, because you cannot have actual exchange if you don't have the airports and the internet and the platforms necessary for this. Yes, so they are necessary, but they are not sufficient in order to boost economic growth. What is really needed is the actual flows to happen. This interpersonal and informational exchange that we spoke about, that needs to actually happen. So this is what they find. And this is in line also with the results that previous studies have shown. Of course, their results are a bit more detailed because, as we spoke, by having the newer globalization index, it allows for more insights in the analysis. The old studies, they didn't have the distinction de jure de facto. So this allows us to have more insight, and we saw that there can be really a difference between the de jure and the de facto part for the different dimensions. Also, the previous index was not as detailed with the different dimensions. Didn't classify, as we spoke, between the trade globalization and financial globalization. So all those classifications allows us for more insights into what really matters for economic growth. So that's the finding. And yeah, further results that they do in more details, how they did many more analysis. I'm trying just to summarize here the results for you, even if you're not able to understand exactly the econometrics and the empirical analysis that they did. So further analysis that they do shows that every single sub-dimension of the economic and the social globalization leads to economic growth. Remember, economic, it was the trade globalization, the financial globalization. The social globalization, again, if I go back to the table, let me show you here. So the economic globalization with its trade and financial globalization aspect. The social globalization with its interpersonal, informational, and cultural aspect, they find that all of those dimensions, all of those sub-dimensions individually, if they are tested individually, contribute to higher economic growth. So they seem to be all mattering. As I said, for economic globalization, more the right-hand side, the de jure aspects. For the social globalization, more the de facto side, the left-hand aspect. But out of all of these, they find what is really striking and having the highest impact seems to be the interpersonal globalization. This one here. The de facto interpersonal globalization. So really the exchange of people between borders and the exchange of information between borders, the exchange between people in different countries, be it the exchange through voice traffic, people talking to each other, or transfers that happen from one country to the other. And we will talk in more detail about this when we talk about remittances and people transferring money from one country to another if they work in one country and transfer money back home to support their families. So that's interpersonal connection here. Of course, with the financial aspect, yes. The international tourism, international students, as we spoke about before, and the international migration. So that exchange of people between countries seems to be one of the major aspects. And now let me go back to the summary of the finding. Exactly here, yes. So they seem to find all those subcomponents matter. However, interpersonal globalization, they found, has the biggest effect on economic growth within the social dimension. So more than the cultural globalization and the informational globalization, they find that the interpersonal one shows the highest impact. For those of you who had before a little bit of quantitative analysis or econometrics, how do they see this? They see this because the coefficient is higher. So the coefficient tells us that the impact is of a larger effect or a larger magnitude on economic growth. Okay, so this is really insightful and shows us that on the one hand, we can have an index that summarizes so many components. But again, if we do the analysis, it's nice again to disaggregate again and try to find, okay, if we find that the total globalization index, when it's higher in countries, they are growing more, we can again go and disaggregate and ask ourselves further, okay, which dimension is driving this? Economic, political, or social? So that's what the authors did. And then go further and say, okay, if economic globalization matters, do trade and financial globalization matter, or is just one of them? If social globalization matter, which one is driving this result? The informational, the intercultural, or the interpersonal dimension? And they can dig deeper and check this. And again, for all dimensions, they can see, okay, is it the de jure part and the de facto part? And we've seen now that there can be differences between the de jure and the de facto, between the different dimensions, between some aspects that matter more than the others. This quantitative analysis doesn't only allow us to find out whether any dimension matters or not. It's not just the black and white aspect, this matter significantly or doesn't matter, but it also allows us to tell how much it matters by determining all those numbers that you find in the tables that tells us, okay, if something significantly matters by how much. And out of this, they can again quantify the results, and they can go one step further and say, okay, which of those components even matter more? Of course, we shouldn't forget that all those dimensions are strongly interrelated and interconnected. Of course, some of them reinforce each other. And we spoke about this at the beginning, if you remember, when we spoke about the dimensions, and we spoke about how some aspects of them reinforce each other. And so if people, for example, if companies are sending their people to work in a different country because they have a subsidiary in a different country, that's the economic globalization. If we talk about foreign direct investment, if they have if Samsung, if LG, if they have their factories in different parts of the world, and they're sending people out of Korea there. So this is not just the economic globalization, but of course it has also social globalization dimension, because the people will travel, they will see different parts of the world, they will interact with the people there, different ideas, different exchange, and so on. This would maybe trigger some other people to visit them there, so there's going to be more exchange. It can curb tourism, it can curb the intercultural exchange. So of course, those dimensions are interconnected and interrelated, and some of them reinforce each other, but still by doing this aggregation in the analysis, we can get much further insights into what exactly is what makes globalization drive or foster or enhance or promote economic growth. Okay, so here we already got some insights. In next chapters, we will even get further insights, even more detailed, by not looking at globalization anymore as one aspect altogether, but by concentrating on different topics of globalization. So our next chapter will be on remittances. So we will forget about all those dimensions and just concentrate on the remittances part. People that travel to work in another country and send money back home, that's economic remittances. But we will also see that there is a social remittances part, and we will analyze in more detail just about remittances. Then we will have a chapter about foreign direct investment. That's economic globalization, and we will analyze much more into depth about this. So this gives you already overview about globalization with some details here about the different components. But we will not just stop here in this lecture, but we will go deeper and take important aspect of globalization, such as remittances, such as foreign direct investment, and analyze them into much detail, understand what they mean, what they imply, and their impact on economic growth and development. Also, don't forget that we said economic growth is not just, economic development is not just about economic growth, right? It's much broader than this. So far, we use this index only to look at what is the impact on economic growth, because this is the analysis done in this paper. But before we finish this chapter, I also want to look with you at, okay, I'll get to this point maybe again. What is the impact also on development, on further aspect of development? So if you remember, we said economic growth is necessary for economic development. Economic growth is just increase of GDP per capita, real GDP per capita. But we said economic development, and you all studied this, is much broader than this and includes much more aspects than just economic growth. What other aspects does development and economic development include that go beyond economic growth? Could anyone tell me? Okay, I'm not continuing until I hear something, because this at this point it's so frustrating to ask this question and not get any feedback. Honestly, because this is like the core aspect that we had for one whole chapter. And 1 week after the midterm, it's even more frustrating, to be honest. So let me repeat the question again. So we said economic growth is necessary but not sufficient for economic development. Economic development is much broader than this. So what other aspect does economic development entail that are more than just increase of GDP per capita?
Social standards like healthcare, infrastructure, and everything. Like a better wealth, knowledge, scholarships.
So who's speaking?
Dominic.
Dominic, okay. Whenever you want to speak, please raise your hand first so that we know who's speaking. But correct, could you repeat, please?
Yeah, it's like it's broader, so infrastructure, healthcare. Yeah, to receive knowledge, also like how many years you are in the school and how like the quality of the knowledge is, so that you can have like a better access to knowledge and everything.
Okay.
Infrastructure, like public transport.
Okay. Anyone would like to add to this? Joy?
I'm not sure if you can hear me because I'm there and it's noisy. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, but there is so much disturbance in the Joy. I don't know if you're in a very crowded place or if it's an okay. I can't really identify what you're saying, huh? Sorry. Maite? What does it? What does it? Sustainability. Yes. Yes. Okay. So sustainability. Tra.
Um,
Okay. Yes. Okay, thank you. Tra, would you still like to add something? Or
Yeah,
is it covered?
I was just going to add there was also indication for a long and healthy life, like life expectancy, and as well as gender equality.
Okay, so gender, right, and life expectancy. So we spoke also about the Human Development Index, which captures 3 dimensions of what we spoke about, and we spoke also about extensions of that index that capture further dimensions. Yeah. Any more that you would like to add? So GDP per capita, what doesn't it include? Very important aspect that it definitely doesn't include as an average figure. Anyone? Inequality, right? Inequality, and this is of course a very important topic when it comes to globalization. I mean, one of the main claims of people that are rather against globalization is to say, okay, globalization increases inequality. The idea, even in economic theory on globalization, you always have like winners and losers, winning sector, losing sector. So globalization could really have an effect on inequality in countries, and we need, so all what you talked about, human capital or human development, inequality, poverty, even aspects that go beyond this, gender issues, even human rights, all those aspects that go beyond just increase of GDP per capita, we need also to see how are they affected by globalization, right? So we know now globalization can increase with its different dimension economic growth, but this is not what we're all or this is not just what we're interested in. Now we know this is necessary for economic development, yes, but it's not enough. It's not sufficient. So we need more. So therefore, I have summarized for you now also further results that tackle, okay, now what about impact of globalization on all those different aspects of economic development? So there have been some studies, and many of them are also. So I've collected from different parts of different papers. Some of them, if they are very recent, they are using the new globalization index that we spoke about. And if the studies are a little bit older, like if the study is maybe 7, 8 years old or something, then they are using the older version of the index that is not as detailed as the new version, right? So I think this is a topic where we're definitely still going to see lots of research and lots of new insights in the next years using the new index, like the paper that I asked you to read. So the paper that I asked you to read did the analysis on economic growth. So others are trying now also to check with the same new index, okay, how does it affect other dimensions of economic development? So let me try to here go over that, and we're going to be discussing also in between those different aspects. So let me first start with inequality. So a big, as I said, criticism of GDP per capita is always the claim, okay, but, and it's a correct claim, to say, okay, but GDP per capita or income per capita is just an average figure, and it doesn't tell us anything about the distribution within the society. So the question, does globalization increase inequality? Is a very important question that we need to tackle. Now, this is nice. This study here by Heimberger is a very recent one from 2020. So it's using also recent data on the topic. And it's nice because it's also a meta-analysis. What's a meta-analysis? I'm not sure you came across that term before, but whenever you find a paper in the literature, if you're researching on any topic and you find a meta-analysis paper, this would give you lots of help. Because a meta-analysis means basically the authors are reviewing all the literature that exists on that topic before, and see, do they come to a consensus, to a common conclusion? Is there still lots of discrepancy in the findings? Some find a positive effect or a negative effect, or some find the effect to be significant and dominant and others not. So they basically review, usually depending on the topic and how much research is on that, dozens at least, if not actually hundreds of papers that are all published and well recognized and so on. Usually those papers use different time frames, different models, different data sets, and can come with different conclusions. So they try to basically get an overview of the literature and try to tell us some consensus of the literature that we can say with confidence, okay, most of the studies find this or that. So whenever you're doing any kind of research, if you're writing a bachelor thesis, if you're writing a seminar thesis, if you're doing research for a presentation, if you find a paper on your topic that's doing a meta-analysis, and especially if it's a published one, this is always very helpful for you and maybe should be your starting paper, because in that you will find hundreds of papers cited. Of course, you don't need to check them all out, but you will find already their consensus and their conclusion. And then you can take it from there and maybe check a few further papers, depending on how deep your research needs to be. So this is always a very good point. So a recent meta-analysis on the effect of economic globalization. So see here, they were mainly interested in economic globalization, not all globalization, but economic globalization and how it affects income inequality. Why economic globalization? Because of the many claims that we hear about, okay, but having lots of international trade could increase inequality in countries. We have winners and losers. When basically you used to be a producer of something, but now this product is no longer needed because people are just importing it from abroad. They are importing it from China or importing it from any other part of the world. So that sector will be maybe shutting down, people will be laid off, other sectors will be winning, and this could create some sort of inequality. This claim is also often mentioned in the field of financial globalization. Talking about international investors, the investors that are looking for the best opportunities to invest internationally are getting richer and richer, while this could also be increasing inequalities. So let's look at the results here of this meta-analysis. So they did a meta-analysis of the literature and also meta-regression findings. I don't want to spend much time explaining what this basically means, but they basically take regression results, empirical results from other papers, and run some empirical testing on them as well in order to find out again about which results are dominant and significant and with which confidence intervals and so on. But anyway, what you should be more interested in here is, or what we are more interested in here in our lecture is, what are the results that this paper finds out? So the paper finds out that after reviewing all this literature, that globalization has a small to moderate inequality increasing effect. So they could really confirm that yes, more globalization, especially economic globalization here is what they are tackling, is in fact leading to more inequality. Yes. And how big is the effect? It's small to moderate. So it's not strongly increasing inequality, but it is increasing inequality in a small to moderate way. Okay, this is maybe a general statement. So let's get into some more details of their finding. Now it's good to differentiate again. So we know economic globalization, we can differentiate trade and financial globalization. And this is again what they do here. And they find that the effect of trade globalization on inequality is rather small. Okay, so trade globalization is not really increasing inequality that much. However, when it comes to financial globalization, the inequality increase is more sizable, is bigger, and is also significantly stronger. So when we say there is a small to moderate inequality increasing effect of economic globalization, this second statement tells us that is more driven from financial globalization rather than trade globalization. And as you know, there is already lots of talk about the international companies, the multinational companies, and how much they are making lots of profit across the world. Recently, just last year, a tax was imposed after some consensus between countries on international companies to avoid that they are reducing that much paying taxes in countries. But we will get into more details about this when we talk about foreign direct investment in a later chapter. But there is already lots of talk about how financial globalization could be actually making many people and many companies, especially giant companies across the world, much richer, much profitable, while others are maybe more left behind. Yeah. Also, maybe if you are following what's happening around you in your countries or across the world in recent years, many countries are also debating a lot about imposing taxes on capital returns, right? So that not just people's income is taxable, but many countries have the issue that when you work as a labor force, your income is taxable, you pay taxes. But when you invest and make capital returns, in some countries, it's not taxable. You don't pay taxes on this. Or some countries have only recently imposed also taxes on capital returns. So when people invest in other countries, when people invest in stock markets and make lots of money out of this, is this also taxable or not? And you will not find one answer, because different countries have different regulations and the amount of tax is different and so on. So these are all things that also could explain to us why also the effect is more sizable for financial globalization. Okay, then what they also do, again, as our other study, is basically to look at, is this effect similar for developed countries and developing countries? And what they find is that there is an average inequality increasing impact in both advanced or developed countries and developing countries. So they seem to find that this effect is not just in developing or not just in developed countries, but seems to be something that is found in both types or categories of countries, the more developed ones and the less developed countries. Finally, and I see there's one raised hand, I'm going to get to you in a minute. They also find that this impact on inequality could be affected if certain conditions are fulfilled in the countries. So what they find is countries that are more educated experience less increase in inequality because of globalization. Again, let me rephrase this. So they find that countries with better education are having less negative effect on inequality, less widening gap in inequality compared to countries that are less educated. Okay, why could this be the reason? That more educated countries, actually more educated and more technologically driven countries, they find, so education and technology, they seem to lower the effect of inequality, on income inequality by globalization. Could you think of why this is the reason? Johan?
Maybe because it makes the people of the country more competitive on the international market, and then they can keep up with like the increasing competition. Right.
So people are more competitive, are also more flexible in maybe changing jobs, in learning, like when the market becomes so if some countries are maybe specialized in doing a certain thing, but then that kind of production is no longer now what they do best. There are other countries that are doing it better and cheaper, right? So they basically have to find a different niche. So if people are more educated and the country has good technology, they can basically use the education of the people and the technology in basically finding themselves a better niche. And this is something that we've been experiencing, for example, here in East Asia. If you see what kinds of products Korea, for example, was specialized in 20 years ago versus 15 years ago versus 10 years ago versus now, it's getting more technologically sophisticated. It's becoming more advanced. It's becoming more, if you want the term, they move up in the ladder of sophistication and specialization. Instead of doing, for example, simple electronics, now it's becoming much more detailed and sophisticated and advanced technology, while simple things are done in other countries. It's cheaper and more efficient, and we spoke about this with the outsourcing and the offshoring, and with the production process being split into different parts of the world. It's no longer the case that everything has to be produced from A to Z in one location. So countries that are having a better educated labor force and have more human capital, and countries that have better technology, they can adapt quicker, easier. There is already a base that you can build on. So when educated people are facing the situation of losing maybe their job because maybe they're working in a sector that is now shutting down in that country because it's opening up in another country because it's more efficient. So they're losing their jobs. If they are more educated and if there is more technology available, basically people can cater better for this position. It's easier if you're already educated to maybe have an additional course or additional kind of education or 1 year degree on top or any training on top that makes it possible for you to adjust and maybe work in a slightly different thing that is still, of course, connected to what you were trained in, but you can already build on what you already know and what you already did before and still get to a new cutting edge. While countries that have already very limited years of education, of course, are already less competitive and, of course, also much more vulnerable. So many countries, many poorer countries of the world, many developing countries of the world are, of course, having now, for example, so much imported very simple goods from China. So they can't compete with that. It's super cheap. And it's already the very basic goods that they really can't compete with at that low price. However, when people are more educated, and when people are also able to deal with technology better, and when there is already some technological progress and technological standards in the country, the situation is very different. And people are also less vulnerable. It's not very easy to be shaken. The economy is totally shaken and many people lose their jobs. Yes, this can always happen, but it's easier to find new jobs for the people. It's easier to train the people for something else. It's easier to still find a new niche. It's easier to adapt the more advanced technology in opening up maybe other fields and other sectors and other job opportunities and having other investments that still absorb all this human capital that is already there in the population. So this is actually understandable that education and technology, and again, we see how everything is interconnected. So human capital and technology, they can basically mediate and lower negative effects of globalization. So nobody is saying globalization doesn't have any negative effects. We have our last part of this chapter will be even shocks of globalization that can have severe effects on countries. So if the world is globalized and the world is getting more and more globalized and is already strongly globalized, of course, you can have lots of benefits from globalization, but it makes also countries vulnerable because when a shock happens somewhere else in the world, it can also hit you at home. And we will talk in more detail about this. And in fact, nowadays, this is again a topic that is very important, with several international shocks happening. But it happened also in history, even in recent history, financial crisis, for example, 2009, and how it hit world markets, not just the country where it started, the US, right? So this vulnerability can be always lower when you're already standing on, if you want, some sort of stable feet, a stable ground. But if you're already struggling as a country very strongly, usually those kind of shocks can hit you much, much stronger. And with globalization in general, having better education, having better technology can definitely mediate those inequality increasing effects. So these are the summary of the findings of this meta-analysis. So yes, increase of inequality, but happens more from financial than trade. Globalization happens in developing and developed countries. However, with more education and technology, countries can have lower negative impact or lower widening of the inequality gap that they have. Okay, now we had, I think it was Nico, I'm not sure, with the question. I hope you can still remember it. Or is it maybe? Yeah.
No, it was just because I've seen a video just yesterday that was about how modern families or how modern societies increase social inequality. It's not specifically about globalization, but it was just interesting because it fits to the topic, I think. And they said that South Korea, for example, and also other developed countries, that they will have to face the problem of the widening age gap, because a lot of young families or young people, they don't want to get married, they don't want to have children, and it's going to be a problem who's going to pay for the pensions in the future. And that's also, I think it could increase social inequality.
Yes. Yeah, so definitely that's an issue here in South Korea that has been also an issue in other developed countries. Germany has been talking about this already for many years. Before, also Japan has been experiencing this situation. Yes, but also, and we'll get to that and at the end also of this chapter, other shocks that we're having at the moment. So what about COVID? What about other things? I don't want to take the discussion already now. How is it also affecting different aspects of development in developing and in developed countries? And inequality increase is something that is definitely strongly on the agenda nowadays with many recent global developments that we're facing. So we'll definitely get back to this topic again, either later at today's session or maybe that would be the beginning of next class. Okay, any more questions or comments on that? Okay, so, and you see the beauty here of the meta-analysis because it summarizes all the literature findings. So for every single aspect here, 1, 2, 3, 4, you already have plenty of literature done on this. And they basically try to summarize with the meta-analysis the consensus of the literature. So you would have some literature finding no real effect, very small effect, large effect, and so on, but they try to look at, okay, what is the vast majority in a significant way finding, and basically summarize those findings, which makes those meta-analysis very, very nice. You can't actually have a meta-analysis on every topic. It needs to be a topic that has been already relatively well researched. Because otherwise, if you don't have consensus yet in the literature, and there are many topics like that, where you still find contradictive evidence. Some find it positive, some find negative effect, and so on. So it's more difficult to have a meta-analysis because the research is still very heated and going on and very controversial. Okay, Now, another paper that also here looks at whether globalization increases inequality and actually shows an interesting aspect. So I thought I should also discuss this with you and have it here covered. Is also again a recent paper from 2020, again well published by Plininger and Sturm, and they found this is not a meta-analysis. This is again a single analysis like the one that we had in our paper on economic growth. So again, they have a panel data analysis where they have 62 countries covered and a long time frame between 1975 and 2014. So please see here, published 2020, but the data goes until 2014 only. This is very common in research because it takes some time until recent data is published. So always, whenever you use the most recent data, usually it's a few years back. And when researchers write a paper, it takes time until it's published. That process can take sometimes even 2 or 3 years. So this is very common. So it's not easy to find research that covers data that goes until 2020 or 2021. That's very difficult. Especially in those kind of development topics. Now, maybe if you have research about financial markets, the data is very available on a daily basis. But those development indicators that we're talking about, some of them are not even published on a yearly basis. Okay, so panel data, what does it mean? We explained this again before. In this case here, a cross-country panel means they are taking several countries, in this case 62 countries, over a long period of time. So the data is two-dimensional. You have many countries, and for every country, you have a long time series. So that's why it is called the panel data. And as I told you before, this kind of analysis makes the analysis richer and allows to get better empirical evidence on what's really going on, in very simple words. So what do the authors here find? They find that the effect of globalization on redistribution, so countries that have inequality, or sometimes to prevent large inequalities, many countries do redistribution. What does redistribution mean? For example, with taxes. If a country has a progressive tax system, meaning that the richer are paying larger taxes than the poorer, and I don't mean in absolute terms. Of course, richer always pay more in absolute terms, but I mean as a percentage of every single dollar or euro that they are earning. So progressive tax system basically means if you earn more, the share of every extra dollar that you're earning is larger compared to poorer people. While usually those that have a very low income are even exempted from taxes. This is one way of redistribution, taxes, especially income tax when it's progressive. Other ways of redistribution is, for example, transfers, welfare transfers. So for example, if the country has a welfare program that supports the poor, that gives, for example, unemployment benefits to those that are unemployed for a certain period of time, or to give some assistance and aid to the poor people in terms of certain aspects in health care or in education and so on. So what they did is basically they looked at how does globalization affect the distribution in countries. Do countries that are more globalized do more or less redistribution? And more redistribution basically reduces inequality, right? So if you're helping more the poor, if you're having larger taxes on the richer compared to the poor, this is more redistribution, and usually this reduces inequalities in countries, right? So what they found is that the effect of globalization on redistribution is depending, conditional means it depends on, and this is now very interesting, on ethnic fractionalization. That's something completely different. So in other words, what they found is that countries that are highly ethnically fractionalized, what does ethnically fractionalized mean? Maybe we should make clear that this is clear for everyone. So what does it mean, higher ethnic fractionalization? Anyone? Any idea what it means? So it basically looks at whether a country has different ethnicities or not, and how far is the country, how large are the shares of different ethnicities within one country. So for example, South Korea is a country that is seen to have almost no ethnic fractionalization, as being as originally just one ethnicity. And now maybe with some intercultural marriages and so on, but this is very new for South Korean society to have ethnically mixed children, for example. And it sticks mainly with children. You barely find elderly that are ethnically mixed in South Korea. But if you compare with other countries, that's something that is actually not the case. There is much more exchange, not exchange, but much more mixing between ethnicities, and some countries actually are very strongly ethnically fractionalized, that actually within one country they have so many ethnicities living together. So that's a term, fractionalization, that you have in the social science literature, actually not just in economics, it's actually even more in anthropology and in political science and in sociology, to look at also fractionalizations. And you can look at not just ethnic fractionalizations, but you can classify countries according to ethnic fractionalization or language fractionalization. Some countries, all people speak one language. But some countries, sometimes there are dozens of languages spoken, because there are so many tribal languages, and you can imagine this makes communication more difficult. Other aspect of fractionalization, religious fractionalization. Some countries have so many different religions, others not. So these aspects of fractionalizations are often studied in social science because they are interesting to look at. They are interesting to see countries that are more fractionalized. Does this affect any other socioeconomic variables that we're having? Does this affect whether it's more easier to establish a democracy or not? Is affect social outcomes, affect educational outcomes, and so on. So this is common in social science literature. Now, what they are doing here, back to our results, they basically look at ethnic fractionalization, and they find that countries that are highly fractionalized ethnically, so when there are many ethnicities in the country and lots of ethnic fractionalizations, the governments of those countries are basically facing more political obstacles to redistribute. So basically policies, in other words, policies in those countries that are meant to reduce inequality are more difficult to happen. Because the country is already somehow fragmented. Different ethnicities, sometimes when there is strong ethnical fractionalization, what happens a lot is basically you have different interests, different interest groups, depending on the ethnicity. And this apparently affects the politics in a way that makes it less possible in order to cater for the higher inequality. So that's interesting. So here they find that the effect of globalization on inequality is not a uniform one, is not a linear one across all countries, but they find that countries that are having less ethnic fractionalization, they deal with the situation better. They manage politically easier to come with policies that basically allow for remedies for any increase in inequality, while countries that are more fractionalized, probably they are already struggling more with their institutions, because they are probably not strongly unified, probably not very democratic already, and have different interest groups, sometimes even fights between the different ethnicities. So less stability and so on. And this makes it more difficult to mediate and reduce any negative effect of globalization on inequality. And that's interesting here to see that the effect is not universal somehow, but often also depends on other aspects. So we've heard already in the meta study that the level of education in a country and the level of technology in a country matters in the effect of globalization on inequality. But here we see that additionally also things that are something completely different, like ethnic fractionalization, can also matter. And this makes the question, does globalization increase inequality, more difficult to answer, because the answer depends also on so many aspects. Whether we're speaking about countries that have better or less better education, technology, whether we're talking about here trade, globalization, economic globalization, other aspects of globalization, and even other conditions like here ethnic fractionalization can matter in answering that question. Okay, then let's talk about poverty. So if we speak about inequality, we can't skip also talking about poverty, especially when we're talking more about the, when we're speaking more about the developing countries. So in developing countries, many are having also high incidences of poverty. What is a very typical way of measuring poverty? And I can see that only very few students are turning on their cameras. As mentioned before, for successful globalization, for successful participation, it would be good to see more of you and to have more interaction in class, please. So this is a small-sized course and is really meant to be interactive and not just a frontal lecture. So yeah. What is one way of measuring poverty? What is a common way of measuring poverty? Maite? GDP per capita? Why? Okay, but GDP per capita gives you only the average GDP per person, and it doesn't tell you anything about how it's distributed among the society. How would you be able to know if we're rich or poor? Okay, let's hear more. Jin.
I'm not quite sure, but I think before I learned that it's also, I mean, it's estimated through consumption. So, like for example, in the market.
Okay.
Can you rephrase that? There was a internet connection problem, so I'm not sure if you were able to hear me.
Yes.
Oh yes, the consumption. So like in the market, like more people buy from the market, like the food, water, and things that they need for their lifestyle. then they try to estimate that for the poverty rate too.
Okay. I get to that again, Mustafa.
I feel like a good way to be able to, I guess, measure would be comparing it to what you would need to survive in a way. Because I feel like if you don't really make the amount that you need to survive, for example, if you don't have if you don't make enough to be able to pay for shelter or food and all the other necessities, then I think that's considered to be the poverty line. I mean, I wouldn't say poverty line because I feel like poverty and being poor is a little different. Because I feel like being poor is still, you're still able to survive in a way. But I feel like poverty is I think poverty is where you are basically, you need assistance in order to survive. But I feel like poor, it's, I feel like you don't really need assistance to survive, but yeah, I see it as that.
Okay, Amina.
Thank you.
I think you measure it by comparing the income a person has to the amount that is needed to cover your basic needs.
Right. So this is the idea of the absolute poverty, how absolute poverty is measured. There is the international poverty line that is calculated by the World Bank. Maybe you've heard before about the $1 a day cutoff point. This is how it started, but they recalculate every few years, and nowadays it's $1.9 a day. I wouldn't be surprised if it increases soon. Again, with increase of prices worldwide. But this is meant to be some sort of cutoff point where they are saying, okay, everyone that is below the poverty line, and this is where the term is coming from, is considered poor, and everyone who's above is considered non-poor. This is a very strict way of measuring absolute poverty, and it's done in a way by saying, in line with what others were saying, that this amount of money should be covering certain daily necessities that people can still survive on a daily basis. And if they don't make that point, they are considered poor. Of course, those $1.9 a day are at PPP, what we've learned before, purchasing power parity. Again, like the international income comparison and so on. Why? Because of course, prices are very different worldwide in different countries. So this is what you can afford, given already, or they are taking already into account the different price levels at different countries. Okay, so that's the idea of measuring absolute poverty. There are also different ways of measuring poverty in developed countries, for example. So maybe you've asked yourself, okay, but maybe in South Korea or in Western Europe or in the US, you barely have someone that actually has less than $1.9 a day available. This would be even less than $60 a month. So how come this? Yeah. So yes, still in those countries, people speak about poverty, and you sometimes have statistics in the news that talk about poverty in those countries, but it's a different concept. Why? Because either they are calculating their own national poverty line, not international. This is the international poverty line, and this is comparable across countries. So they are saying, okay, according to our own country standards, we consider those poor that don't make a certain amount of income. And usually they relate this to the average income in a country. So people that have less, often, I think in many OECD countries, it is people that have less than 60% of the average income in the country are considered poor. Something like that. So you see, this is not absolute poverty anymore. It's also a little bit relative, because with the average moving, this bench line or benchmark will also be moving. So it's relative to the average of the society and no longer a fixed amount, like saying, okay, less than 1.9 a day. And it allows to cater for society specialities. So this is a big topic on its own, honestly, and I do this in the introductory lectures. So this is why, if you remember at the beginning of the lecture, I told you, please use the time to have a read of chapter 5 of the textbook, which is on poverty, inequality, and development, which I do in lots of details in the introductory courses. But here I need to take a few things for granted, because we can't spend a whole lecture talking on inequality and a whole lecture on talking on poverty like we did with economic development in the beginning. Otherwise, we'll never talk about globalization. So I already need to take a little bit of things for granted. When we talk about globalization, we'll always touch upon poverty and always touch upon inequality. So again, one final call on that. If for you what I'm saying here sounds new, then you definitely need to have a quick read of chapter 5 of the textbook of Todaro and Smith. You already dealt with economic development and what it means. Chapter 5 builds on this and tackles what is exactly poverty, what is exactly inequality, and how is it related to economic development. You don't need to go over the calculations there, but read it and concentrate on the arguments and understand basic concepts. This will help you in following all the discussions that we have here, because we will always go back to what does this or that imply on poverty or on inequality, and you need to have a good idea about it. Okay, so if you have questions, then you can ask me again, but please make sure if you don't have the background of development economics so far, as we've mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, which is important, make sure to read that chapter 5. Okay, now I'll share the slides again after the break, and we'll talk more about how does globalization affect poverty and look at evidence from empirical studies on that. So I'll see you again in 10 minutes.